Hopefully everyone can see my screen. Someone shout out at me if you can't, because sometimes I think I'm sharing my slides and I'm actually not. So a few announcements before we get started. The first one, if you haven't been before, we have a Facebook group. If you look on Facebook for WordPress accessibility, you'll find our Facebook group. It's a great place to connect with people between meetups, ask questions, get information. I saw someone recently was posting in there because they were having trouble getting the CSS to work to add underlines to all of their links. And so they asked for some help. I posted in recently about an issue with Beaver Builder, and I had like 3 people be like, oh, here's the JavaScript to fix that. Anyway, the Facebook group is a great resource in between meetups. So feel free to join that and connect between meetups. If you are looking for recordings, this meetup is recorded. It takes us about a week to correct the captions and then get the video posted with corrected captions and a full transcript, but it will be available on our website. If you go to equalizedigital.com/meetup, that's a frequently asked question. People always ask how they can get it. And we generally will also post about it in the meetup on the meetup page. So you'll get a notification from Meetup if you RSVP'd on Meetup, and we'll also post about it in the Facebook group when it is available. You can also go to that same page and watch all of the recordings from all of the past meetups as well, including a different one that Karl gave for us earlier in the year. If you are interested in staying on top of WordPress accessibility news and getting email reminders about the meetups and getting email notifications when the recordings are available, please join our email list. It's at equalizedigital.com/focus-state. And we send out emails about twice a month if we're on top of our game. And it's a great resource. And it is more accessible with headings and things like that than the emails that Meetup sends out. We do require sponsors to help us cover the cost for this meetup because we've committed to always having live captionings at our meetups. So we have openings for sponsors for our this daytime meetup starting, I think, next month. So if anyone is interested in sponsoring the meetup, or if their company is interested in sponsoring the meetup, please reach out to us and let us know. We will have captions, otherwise we'll pay for it, but it is helpful if the community can help us as well. If you have any suggestions for the meetup, or you would be interested in speaking, we are actively looking for speakers for over the summer and early fall right now. Please email us, meetup@equalizedigital.com. That goes to myself and Paula. And that's the best way to get a hold of us. And please let us know if there's anything we can do to make the meetup work better for you. Those are most of my announcements. I have not really introduced myself, but if you haven't been before, my name is Amber Hines. I'm the CEO of a company called Equalized Digital. We are a certified B Corporation, and part of organizing this meetup is how we meet one of our goals and objectives as a company to create more education and resources out there. I will also say I do it somewhat selfishly because I love to hear from our speakers and learn from them. And this was a great way to get them to come and answer all the questions that I have. We have a plugin called Accessibility Checker, which you can find on WordPress.org in the repo, that scans for some of the problems, that the ones that can be identified automatically. Not all problems can be, but it does scan for some, and that's available if you're interested. Today, we have 2 sponsors. Our first is Bet Hannon Business Websites. Bet Hannon Business Websites has covered the cost of our live captioning for today. So thank you so much to Bet and her team. We really appreciate it. Bet Hannon Business Websites is a full service WordPress agency providing design, development, managed hosting, and content management services. They have a special focus on website accessibility and they offer accessibility audits as well as remediation assistance. I think they've also helped like some plugin developers and things like that. So it's not always just limited to websites. They also offer services related to integrating WordPress with other platforms, and they have a specialty with complex gravity forms implementations. So let's see. So please check out, learn more about Bet Hannon business websites. We always recommend that you tweet a thank you to our sponsors to help encourage them to continue wanting to sponsor. So if you're interested, you can find Bet on Twitter at Bet Hannon. Thank you to Empire Caption Solutions, since that got interrupted, but they have very kindly offered to transcribe all of our videos so that we can have accurate captions after the fact. We greatly appreciate that. You can get them at Empire Caption Solution on Twitter. Karl is Chief Innovation Officer at Level Access, and he has nearly 2 decades of experience doing IT consulting for the biggest companies in the world and the biggest agencies for the US government. He has previously spoken for us and has done a phenomenal job, and I always feel like I'm learning from him on social media and all those things, so we're excited to have him here. I am going to stop sharing and I'm going to let Karl take over.
All right, thank you for the introduction. Yeah, so let's see if I can figure out this multi-screen thing like we were talking about before. Most notably, where the heck the mouse is the challenge that I always face. All right, so that was a fun intro. I've only seen that happen one other time when somebody comes in like that, and it was less entertaining, mostly entertaining this time because, like Amber was mentioning, early before the thing started, she was talking about whether or not to start doing webinars instead of meetings. We'll see how this goes. This is really exciting. I feel like I got to stay on top of my game in case somebody else jumps in. So this is actually short. This is actually a pretty short presentation. With my slides, there's inevitably going to be somebody who says, can I get a copy of your slides? With all of my presentations, I actually don't have anything meaningful on the slides. As you'll see, usually it's a background image and then a couple of words, unless there's data being presented, and then that's a different story. So that'll be the situation with the slides. I'll explain any visuals that are necessary for understanding, or sometimes they're humorous as well. I try to inject humor into this stuff. Specifically for mainstream audiences, because most mainstream audiences aren't huge fans of accessibility. It seems boring and dry. So if I can make it fun for them, then I will. So super happy to be doing this one. This is a topic that is actually very, very interesting to me. In particular, I've been doing this stuff for a really long time. So for those who don't know me, my name is Karl Groves. Amber has already done a really good introduction, but I've been doing accessibility consulting for about 20 years now. And there's always this question from customers like, can you give us a grade? And really the true answer is, well, if you have accessibility problems, then you fail. That's not a message that most people want to hear. Most people want to hear, that they're doing well. They don't want bad news. Most people just don't want bad news. And unfortunately, when it comes to web accessibility consulting, the news is mostly bad. If somebody is new to accessibility, then it's always going to be bad because people just don't think about it up front, and it's always just going to be a bad time. This question, in terms of can we get a grade, can we get an accessibility score, this topic was raised in my mind after several customers asked me if Tenon can give a grade. Tenon philosophically is a product that's its sole job is to find problems, not to give a grade. So that's one thing that was sort of, something that I had to mention to people, which was, it is a diagnostic tool. It's not a program management tool. There's other tools out there, Level Access, for instance, has a product called AMP. AMP literally stands for Accessibility Management Platform. So it is a more all-encompassing sort of performance, enterprise performance and governance type of platform. We have a new product called 11. 11 is again a much more enterprisey kind of tool, and that has capabilities for scoring and things like that. But part of me, when it came to Tenon and its philosophy on finding problems, really also this question about getting a grade is perplexing in a lot of ways, because what is a grade going to be based on? Like I said, some of my background images have meaning behind them. This background image is a picture of a person assembling an engine, a car engine. I mentioned to Amber before we started that I'm kind of a gearhead. As a matter of fact, once I retire, I'm starting a hot rod shop. But this is there's a tool placed on top of the engine block. It's a metal bar bolted to the block, and its job is to find what's called top dead center. Top dead center is, especially top dead center on cylinder 1, is how you know how to time the engine's ignition and all this other stuff. So what are we going to base our grade on? That's question number one. Getting a grade for something, a grade is really actually kind of simple. You divide the past things, past as in the things that have that are good, by the total things, multiply that quotient by 100, then apply your standard North American grading scale to it. A is 90 to 100, B is 80 to 89, C is 70 to 79, so on and so forth. So if you subject your website to 20 accessibility tests and you pass 15 of those tests, you get a 75, which is a C grade, and you're done. And that is actually the answer to how to score something for accessibility, at least when it comes to an automatic testing tool. Depending on your manual methodology, this idea works there too. There's a number of flaws with most manual testing methodologies that I'll talk about as we go through this. So that's really my answer. Like, if you're not going to listen to anything else, if you're like, you just want the answer to how to get a grade, it's past items, total items, divide those, you're done. There's a lot of things other people talk about when they talk about grading. And so you hear people when they're talking about this concept of applying a grade, there's people who have other things that they want to think about when they talk about the grade. One of those things could be relevance, right? Background image here is a protest poster someone's carrying, and the words on the protest poster says, "I can be persuaded by a logical argument." Okay, so thinking about relevance actually is an interesting one. Most, if not all, automatic testing tools are unable to give a reliable score because they don't track anything but failures. And this goes back to the Tenon philosophy, but it's also true for almost all other tools out there. If you think about it, they're not telling you what is good. They're telling you what is bad. They're telling you they've found an issue. They found a problem. And so there is no concept of relevance in terms of performance. There's no concept of passing other than by virtue of not failing. And you see this a lot when people are talking about accessibility. They're saying, I want a clean score from Wave or a clean score from Axe or whatever, we got no issues. Just because an automatic testing tool didn't find any issues doesn't mean that you haven't gotten any issues. What it means is that you've got no failures from the things that thing tests. And so a pass condition is created by either not failing the existing tests or the tests not being relevant. And this is actually why Tenon doesn't give a grade. It's because it doesn't track what tests are relevant or passed. It just tests failures. So while there is a value in getting a score based on the extent or lack thereof of accessibility errors, it lacks that context. Getting a really useful score requires knowing, a couple of things. First off, of the tests that were relevant, which ones passed and which ones failed. So you really actually have to keep track of what tests were relevant in the first place. Again, to maybe simplify this, let's say we're talking about a testing tool that has tests for tables. You have no tables, and then therefore those tests are not relevant. You can neither pass nor fail those things. And this is actually something that I've had conversations with customers that say, well, an irrelevant thing is a pass because it didn't fail. And I'm like, no, that's really spurious logic. An irrelevant thing can neither pass nor fail because it doesn't meet the criteria to do either thing. To use a computer programming analogy, I think an irrelevant test is something that's null. So for anybody who's done any programming, JavaScript, PHP, whatever, an irrelevant thing is null because it can neither be true or false, right? And that's what I think, and that's how I think about this. We actually built this capability into Mortis.io, which is the Tenon company's manual testing tool. Each test has specific criteria, and those criteria determine if that test is even applicable in the first place. It provides specific instructions for testing, whether it's applicable and whether it's passed or failed. And I believe, at least in terms of scoring, this relevance part is pretty important, and it's important to have that knowledge before we even think about any grading scheme. This is one of my favorite accessibility fail pictures. It is a picture, unfortunately, highly pixelated at this resolution, but there's a set of stairs. There's a ramp on it. It's going at least a 45-degree angle, very high. Clearly not a viable ramp. Probably really fun to go down, well, until you get to the bottom. Impossible to get up. Anyway, the text on the slide says, what about user impact? So this is actually an interesting one. The argument made for factoring in user impact is basically this, that a raw pass versus fail score is fine if everything that we're testing for has the same impact. But we know, and all of us who've done accessibility for any length of time knows, accessibility is different, right? Some things have very different levels of impact for different users. And this is extremely hard to do with automation. A lot of people know me for a lot of my content out there on overlays. And as I often say, in the context of overlays, it's easy to find images that have no text alternatives, right? Very easy to find. You can use there's an algorithm on W3C website about accessible name calculation. You can program something to find the accessible name of something following that algorithm very easily. And so that's really easy. And that's a Boolean sort of pass fail kind of thing. It's really hard to determine whether a text alternative is accurate and informative. As a matter of fact, I served as an expert witness on a legal case called Murphy versus iBobs. One of the big things about Murphy versus iBobs is that the defendant in the case, which is iBobs, their lawyer was trying to argue that we use accessibility, and because we use accessibility, we are compliant. And what we found in our research on accessibility capabilities is that it uses I don't know what library or what system it uses for its image recognition, but it uses some sort of image recognition software that was often wrong. So when we were talking about looking through the machine generated text alternatives that were provided, a lot of them were completely wrong. Sometimes they got the content of the image right, but not the context. So So we know it's really, really, really hard to determine whether text alternative, if it's applied, is correct in the first place. But then there's this whole issue of, if the text alternative is wrong, how wrong is it, right? If we're using this, or if we're gauging our score based on user impact, how bad is it that it's wrong, right? So for instance, if it's a picture of a product and they describe the product, but they get, I don't know, the color of the product wrong, how big of a deal is that? Versus versus whether the text alternative is wrong enough that that the user is missing important information, it's not conveyed any other way on the page, and so on and so forth. That's a different story, right? In one case, we're talking about nuisance, and in the other case, we're talking about complete failure of a core system task. Another thing is that some issues impact multiple user types, and those impacts may vary. So a missing label on a form field, or missing programmatic association for that label, could cause an impact for a person on voice dictation software, but they could use the mouse grid or something like that, and a person who's blind could screw it up completely. So we have a high impact for one population, a medium to low impact for another population. How does that weigh in? For us with Tenon and Mortis, what we do is we actually factor some of that stuff into the prioritization scoring. The prioritization scoring that we use has a number of factors that contribute to the prioritization score. And that's really sort of this severity of impact is combined into the prioritization, not the actual score, so to speak. And priority is simply a measure of urgency that you really want to fix the issue. In other words, you fail, and it's kind of how badly are you failing. That being said, I kind of remain open to the idea that that severity should be its own metric, but I still don't know how to apply that to an accessibility grade. That kind of brings its own set of challenges. What about volume? So the picture here is actually a picture of a tulip field in the Netherlands. I'm assuming millions upon millions of red tulips are in this picture. Okay, so the text on the slide here says, wait, what about volume? So at its most basic, the more issues a system has, the lower its quality. And this is not unique to web, and it's not unique to web accessibility. This is actually a metric that's pretty well tracked traditionally in software QA before the web even existed. But basically, in the context of accessibility, the more accessibility issues a system has, the higher the number of the accessibility issues, the lower its accessibility grade should be, right? It's a lower quality system. So raw issue count, the difference here is on the web, raw issue count isn't really useful without additional context, right? And so this is where the concept called defect density comes in. It takes into consideration the number of issues in the number of issues in the code versus the size of the page. And so Tenon was actually the first accessibility testing tool to provide this metric, but I didn't come up with it myself. This is, again, it's been a traditional QA thing for a long time. In traditional QA, it's defect density is number of issues per 1,000 lines of code. They call it KLOC, number of issues per kilobyte of code. Because websites have many blank lines and a lot of white space, what Tenon does is it collapses all the white space and uses that as kilobyte of source code comparison. And so the logic for defect density is pretty straightforward, right? A simple web page with a lot of issues is worse than a complex web page with the same number of issues. So when I talk about this with customers, what I say is, imagine that you test the Google homepage, right? Google homepage has like a logo, search form, button. On the top and bottom corners, there's other links, settings menus, and stuff like that. but feature-wise, super simple page. We test that, we get 100 issues. And then we take the msnbc.com webpage and we get 100 issues. msnbc.com obviously is much more complex. And lots more content, lots more code, of course. So 100 issues on Google, 100 issues on MSNBC. If we just count raw issue count, of course, that's they're going to seem the same. They're going to seem equal. But we know for a fact that that's not the case. If there's 100 issues on the Google homepage, that means very simply that it's a worse page. It's a much more simple page. And in practice, what we've seen is a strong correlation between density and usability. Pages that exceed 50% density on Tenon are found to be more difficult for users to deal with in the real world. So as density increases, the likelihood that users are going to be completely unable to use the content and features on that page. And at this, in my opinion, actually begs the question as to whether density is really the actual true metric that we should measure a grade on. Picture on the background of this slide is apparently a stuntman who is on a dirt bike riding through, or has ridden through something on fire, and he himself is also on fire. The text on the slide says, "Wait, what about comparing against the norm?" We hear a lot of that in the accessibility consulting field from people who are like, well, how do we compare to our peers? We hear, I've heard that a ton from e-retailers for sure. You know, one retailer would be like, how do we compare against, and they would name their direct competitors, or at least who they see as a competitor. And at this point, the Tenon product has assessed millions of pages on the web and logged tens of millions of issues across those pages. And so this is actually more than enough data for us to calculate any data point that we want with a statistically significant sample size, a confidence level of 99%, and a confidence interval of 1. What I'm saying there is that we can gather any statistics that we want, and it will be an accurate comparison against the web as a whole. And so one way to do that, to do this comparison thing, is to provide a grade based on the norm. In other words, a comparison against all the other pages that have ever been tested. A common example of this could be basically considered like grading on a curve in college. Unfortunately, the normal web page is really bad. So the average number of errors across the web is 83 errors per page. Now, Tenon is a little bit unique in the way it does its testing. We count individual instances of issues. And so let's say we have a table that has 10 columns, and none of those 10 columns has a scope attribute on them. We would log 10 issues. Other tools might log 1 issue and say this table is messed up. So average number of errors per page, 83. The average density is 15%. And so what this means, this average density of 15% suggests that most pages on the web are kind of crappy. So when it comes to grading for accessibility, it doesn't really seem useful to base a grade on a norm when the norm itself is just not accessible. So what about scope? This image doesn't mean anything. What about scope? So there's several layers to consider in a scoring scenario in terms of the scope of the thing we're measuring. And so we'll talk about 3 different layers. The component, that's the individual feature of a page or an application screen, such as its navigation. There's the page, that's going to be the entire page or application screen and all of its individual components. You can also call this a view. And then there's the product, and that's the entire collection of pages or screens that make up the product. So getting a grade on a component is actually really useful, I think. at least determining the urgency with which you need to make repairs. Getting a grade on a page is less useful without any specific means to identify the value of the page. In other words, a per page grade is pretty simple, but getting an A grade on an inconsequential page is less useful than getting an A grade on a page that sees the most traffic from users or includes specific features or documentation for people with accessibility concerns. So at the page level, what tends to happen is that the cumulative grade of the product could be impacted either too high or too low by outliers and that skew the results in one direction or another. So for instance, a great example of this would be pages that are just text, blog posts or documentation or something like that. Let's face it, people do screw that stuff up, but by volume, you're only going to get things like color contrast, headings, that sort of stuff out of mostly text pages, whereas stuff that's interactive is going to have a lot more likelihood of having errors anyway. So identifying the relative importance of a page can be useful, but what I've seen or what I feel in practice is that that's actually probably still better left as part of the priority scoring for those issues. In other words, we're going to deprioritize low traffic, low importance, low interactivity pages from the prioritization and increase the priority for the other things. So in other words, I don't think scope is relevant. Scoping of a page rather is relevant towards a grade. Probably scoping the grades for components is more useful. This background image has 3 slots for binders. The one on the left is numbered 403. The number on the right is labeled 405. That means 404 is not found. Okay, so the text on this slide, no, really, what about relevance? I want to harp on this one a little bit more, and the reason why is relevance is, especially in terms of automatic testing. Well, actually, manual also applies here as well. Whether no matter how we're running this assessment, the relevance of the grade is directly tied to the completeness and relevance of the test set. So the really simple one in terms of automation is the more tests you have, the more complete your coverage is going to be. Of course, as anyone who's involved in automatic testing in general, automatic like unit testing and stuff like that, testing irrelevant stuff or testing inconsequential stuff is a problem. You don't want to just sit there and have a pile of completely irrelevant tests. Assuming, however, we can have a very large set of relevant tests for our system, the more the merrier, right? So it pays to use a product that has a large number of tests. So if you're using, if you're, for instance, basing your score on something you get out of Lighthouse, Lighthouse is good, and the tests within Lighthouse are very good, but there's not a lot of them. Okay, they've chosen to use a subset of the ACTS tests. Even ACTS doesn't have as many tests as, say, AMP or 11 or 10. So that's an important thing to mention. You can close that gap, of course, and you can close that gap with manual testing. And again, you have to have a codified set of manual tests, complete instructions, steps and requirements for determining relevance and relevance, accuracy, and all that sort of stuff. So you can get 100% coverage reliably if both your automated and your manual testing is, of course, complete. So our picture here in the background is another gearhead one. This is a person who's assembling an engine. So he's got pistons on the table and a cylinder head. And our text here on the slide says putting it together. So it turns out, really, in my exploration of this topic, that there's really 2 things that are most important with creating a grade. That's relevance and number of tests, or really one thing, a relevant number or number of relevant tests. That's the most important part. Relevance is really vital. If you have 50 tests to do with forms, but you have no forms on the thing you're testing, then considering those tests into a grade makes no sense and artificially skews your data. The number of tests is vital, because if you don't have a complete and thorough list of tests, then you may not be gathering enough data upon which to base the grade in the first place, and you'll wind up with a score that's not accurate. By the way, you also might remember that I talked about defect density. I mentioned that defect density itself may suffice as the only necessary metric for a grade, but what I found when I was looking at attendance data is that once you start tracking relevant tests and past tests, density is actually automatically figured into that. So either one of those is a fine metric, density or the grade itself, because they're both sort of synonymous at this point. The image in the background of this slide has nothing to do with the content, but I've had it sitting in my slide assets archive for a long time, and I just had to use it. It's a picture of a stormtrooper, and he's holding a sign that says, "At least we didn't kiss our sister." And if you're familiar with Star Trek lore or Star Trek, Star Wars, you'll know where that's coming from. If you haven't, then just watch the first one chronologically or according to release date. All right. And our text says our target must be an A. Regardless of what you base your score on, your target must be an A. So going back to these requests that we've gotten from customers, like how do we compare to our competitor? No, like that's totally the wrong question to ask. Getting a grade that you can look at and immediately know where your system stands is super useful. It's an awesome idea. It's a great way of tracking your progress, provided that, of course, you are tracking your progress. Like, it should be relatively straightforward to get a grade that's useful, and then use that as a, I don't know, a KPI to say, you know, what's our distance from an A. Accessibility, because it's a compliance domain, it's the kind of thing that large companies want to track. And that's fine. But in practice, at least in my history, organizations that do this, or they're kind of doing a bottoms up race to whatever their bare minimum acceptable grade is going to be, and then they stop, right? So they'll be, oh, well, a B is good enough. Well, a B is not good enough. That, you know, that's going to be their target. They're not going to look any further. And so that's why the desire to pursue a grade really is kind of misleading and dangerous anyway. And so I want to read from you the WCAG, quote from WCAG standard. And it says, conformance to a standard means that you meet or satisfy the requirements of the standard. That seems pretty self-explanatory. In WCAG, the requirements are the success criteria. To conform to WCAG, you need to satisfy the success criteria. That is, there is no content which violates the success criteria. So the at-a-glance ability to see a score and intuitively understand how far away you are from getting that grade is cool, but choosing a less than perfect grade as good enough is dangerous, especially when you are working for an organization that has a high risk profile, e-retail, banking, travel, that sort of stuff. Or you have, you know, you're subject to regulatory oversight if you're, you know, if your organization's of a certain size in Canada or Europe, or you're a federal agency or something like that. Like, you have to comply with all of the success criteria at the chosen level of WCAG in order to be considered compliant. A B is not compliant, a C is not compliant. So it's important to keep that in mind, that anybody who asks you this question, like, what's our grade, is, if you have any issues, you are non-compliant. And that's really kind of the message that they need to get. A grade is good for determining how far away you are from that. So the background image here is another funny one. It says, if this, it's a picture in a bathroom. Part of the sign is cut off, but it says, if this bathroom needs service, please turn on the switch. Below that sign is the switch plate that has no switch. Okay, so the text on this slide says there's much more. There's only one true metric, and this is actually one that I borrowed from a friend of mine who was doing accessibility compliance at Google, and he mentioned this to me, that there's really only one thing that we need to track. There's only one real KPI, and that is, will users with disabilities want to use the product? And for this, I'll take us back to another quote from the WCAG standard. It says, although these guidelines cover a wide range of issues, they are not able to address the needs of people with all types, degrees, and combinations of disability. And so the real approach for scoring, it really requires us to interact with the real users, watch them use the product, ask them one of these three questions. If you're not a current user of our product, would you want to use it? Or if you are a current user of our product, would you continue to use it? And third, if you're a former user of this product, would you come back to using it? So while automated and manual testing is really useful in finding potential problems in your product, only usability testing with real users is going to tell you if you've gotten it right. And this one true metric is basically, will people with disabilities want to use this product? That's the way we get our score. So that's me, Karl Groves. You can follow me on Twitter at Karl Groves, where I mainly talk about overlays and politics. The website here, levelaccess.com. My email is karl.groves@levelaccess.com. Are there any questions? I see there's 17 comments in the chat that I haven't read, so let's take a look at some of these and see if there's anything.
There were a couple of comments about, let's see, let me just go back through, about measuring against, which I think you might have touched on, but just in case, measuring against that base of other sites, most of which have problems.
Right.
So I don't know if you have any extra thoughts on that, but.
Yeah, it's really bad. I mean, the reality is there's a lot of bad websites out there, and especially in certain industries or certain market segments, a lot of those can be horrible. Unfortunately, a K-12 is a big area where things are just horrible for people with disabilities to even try to use. So you can kind of guess that the larger the company, the more likely it is that they'll have done something for accessibility. But just in general, I wouldn't use what other people do as a good example or a good thing to follow.
Mm-hmm. So Im had a comment, you can get a 100% accessibility score from certain auto test tools, even though the site is not accessible, or you use workarounds to trick the tools.
Yeah.
I think a good follow-on question like that is, are there common tools that people use that, and I know, like, I'm not asking you to bash on anything, but things that you're like, you wouldn't recommend, or obviously your product is a great product, but are there other things that can be helpful in finding some of the obvious problems, but that won't create a misleading view of what the accessibility status of the product is or the website?
Well, first off, I would say that any testing tool is good as a way to get started, because you're testing. You know what I mean? Like, I got to say that there are tools out there. There's certain legacy tools that I've seen people use that are really old and sort of out of date and things like that. I'm not going to mention their names because I don't want to disparage anybody. But I would say that, I mentioned before Lighthouse. Lighthouse uses a subset of the ACTS rule set. The tests are good. If you're using Lighthouse, and you're doing testing with it, or you're using accessibility insights from Microsoft, which also uses a subset, those are good tests, you know what I mean? And if you're finding if you're finding stuff with those and you're fixing them, you're already doing a good thing. You're not getting a grade because they're just a subset. What I would caution is people trusting any tool as gospel. We see this a lot with legal cases. There's actually a law firm in Beverly Hills that fires out these demand letters, and they base all of their stuff on Wave. Now, Wave is awesome. It's the number one downloaded and used accessibility testing tool for a reason, right? But Wave, in the hands of an amateur, can be deceiving. You know, you see it, because what it's going to list on Wave is outright errors, color contrast problems, which you do sometimes need to verify, then warnings, and also information. The warnings could be completely irrelevant. They could just be wrong, and that's fine because they disclose that it's a warning. And then the information ones, that's just for information for you to assist you when you're doing your manual checking. But a lot of people don't understand that, and they'll take it as gospel. Or even my tool or others will have an accurate test, but there's a conditional thing that makes it irrelevant, right? And so, you know, I used to use this line from, I used to work at a Harley dealership a long time ago, and there was a mechanic there. We called him Old Man Brian. His name was Brian, and he's old. But he used to say, there was this younger kid that worked as a mechanic next to him, who he had the worst Snap-on habit in the world. Snap-on is a tool company. They'll drive to, like, you know, auto shops or something like that. They sell you tools, and they have the best tools. They're phenomenal tools, Snap-on is. But this kid always had to have the latest and greatest stuff. And Brian would say, it's a poor mechanic who blames his tools for, you know, not getting the job done right. And I carry that over to everything else. Like, if you don't understand what the testing tool is doing, then you're going to have problems. You know, like, you're going to get misled, you're going to chase your tail, you're going to not. So that's the only thing I would say about some of that stuff is tool quality is a big deal. Understanding the tool is even bigger.
For people that are just getting started, what resources do you have for, like, learning or trying to better understand the tools and creating what their process should be for testing?
Ooh, that's a good question. For anyone involved in accessibility, or especially anyone new for accessibility, go to the WebAIM website, webaim.org. You know, they were instrumental in both their website and their discussion lists were instrumental for me when I was starting out, and I still point people there. Huge shout out to the folks at WebAIM. I love them all dearly. Small plug. Level Access has released Access Academy. Access Academy is awesome. Got some free courses, and it talks about everything from strategy to developer stuff.
Awesome. Let's see. I don't see too many more questions coming in, so feel free, anyone, if you have questions, put them in. But I have one or two others that I sort of thought of while Karl was talking. Otherwise, we might wrap a little early. But so one thing I was wondering, because you mentioned that there are some law firms that just use the testing tools. Do you feel like there is a good response to that if someone has a client that gets a demand letter? I mean, obviously the ideal response, of course, is make the website accessible or do user testing and prove that it already is, and that was a false flag on Wave or whatever that might be. But do you have any thoughts on that, having been involved in some of the lawsuits as an expert?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, it's a huge topic, because there are trolls out there who, they'll go away for $4,000, right? And some of them, not all of them, a lot of them want real money, but there's some of these folks who are just, they'll just settle for like $4,000. They'll go away. And you got to ask yourself, like, my lawyer, at least before we got acquired by Level Access, my lawyer was $500 an hour. So we're not talking a lot of time before that $4,000 is run out with me paying my lawyer to fight this thing. The other reality is they probably have a good complaint, right? So if you have a website and somebody reaches out to you and says we're going to sue you, unless you know for a fact your website is accessible, they might have a point. And that's actually a huge problem. It makes it really hard to defend. Obviously, the bigger your company, the more money you have to fight this sort of stuff, and there you go. But there's something to be said for just fixing your stuff. As a matter of fact, when it comes to a legitimate complaint, all paths lead to you fixing your stuff. If you follow the possible options, we actually have a flow chart. There's a blog post on Tenon website, blog.tenon.io, and I forget what the blog post is titled, but we have a flow chart, and it says basically all paths lead to fixing your stuff. Either if you fight the lawsuit and you win, the only way you're winning is because you already have an accessible site. If you settle, you have to fix your site. If you lose, you have to fix your site. So there's only one way to deal with lawsuits, and that's to fix your site. So that's the one thing I would say. The other part, just strategically, is that some lawsuits can be mooted. Mooting in legal terms is a strategy where you basically pull the rug out from underneath the plaintiff by making it no longer an issue. So fixing your site before the trial date, and then you have the lawsuit thrown out, and so on and so forth. That's legal stuff that I can't get into any more than that, other than knowing that I have seen it happen and participated in it happening. But there's lots of legal mumbo jumbo behind that I'm underqualified for.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I appreciate the thoughts, and I mean, obviously that would be the most ideal response, right? Is you get a complaint and you just go fix it, and you say, oh, thanks for letting us know. Here's
yeah,
the fix on our website.
yeah.
So someone said they're trying to learn web development. I find myself paralyzed because I'm terrified of learning inaccessible practices because accessibility is usually treated as an afterthought. Can you recommend any courses, I think they're referencing, on web development that account for accessibility throughout?
Man, I wish there was a good answer for that.
So I know Joe Dolson does some LinkedIn learning stuff. I don't know if I know he has one on accessibility. I'm not certain if he has any, without going and looking, if he has just web development courses, but I would guess if he does on LinkedIn Learning, that might be a good resource.
Yeah, that's true. There's a couple of LinkedIn Learning courses that are out there that have covered some of that. Joe Dolson, I think Marcy Sutton had some stuff out there. Gerard Cohen, I think he did one on lynda.com or something like that. I just put a link to an Amazon purchase for a book called Designing with Progressive Enhancement. That the book is a little bit on the out of date side when it comes to like modern practices. However, if you're just learning web development, this is going to cover a lot of really good stuff. That'll be a big deal because it'll talk about JavaScript. It has, it's HTML, CSS, CSS3 stuff. So it's semi-modern, but a lot of the JavaScript in there is jQuery rather than, more modern framework stuff. But that will teach a lot of the fundamentals for that stuff. And also, again, this is another one that's really out of date. Beginning JavaScript with DOM scripting. A little good friend of mine, Christian Hellman, wrote this book.
I think while you're looking for that, Glenn commented in the chat that if you start with semantic HTML, that's a great start for accessible practices. So maybe don't skip those HTML basics courses.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Christine,
The unfortunate part is not a lot of those resources out there talk about semantic HTML. Like they don't show you, like none of the websites that are out there, like tutorial websites, even care about semantic HTML for the most part. So yeah.
yeah. Christina commented that Juneau College in Toronto's web development bootcamp program integrates accessibility. She
That's
attended
cool.
that on a scholarship, and there was accessibility there.
That's cool.
Yeah. Here's a question that is very current. So how does accessibility fit into metaverse and Web3 and future emerging technologies like virtual reality, AR, VR, MR? I know what, like AR, I know VR, I don't know MR. What is the scope of accessibility in these areas? Do you have thoughts on this,
Yeah,
Karl?
that's so Glenn Walker can answer that one, which is Thomas Logan. Thomas Logan is probably the first resource I would point anybody to for AR and VR stuff. So yeah.
And that's Glenn posted in the chat, just in case anyone can't see it, Thomas Logan of the A11Y NYC meetup.
Yeah.
So, do you know if those are virtual meetups?
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
anyone can join. Great. There was a comment or a question later on or earlier back that said, one thing I've considered is using a VPAT template for developing an accessibility score. So removing the non-relevant items and creating a score per accessibility level. For example, level A only has 10 relevant items, divide that by 100 or so on for each level. Does this seem problematic? And the person said, keeping in mind, this is for clients who just really want to have a score.
Yeah, I don't really agree with the idea of using VPAT for that. VPAT is great for disclosing where your failings are at a success criteria by success criteria way. I agree with that. But as far as like, do we have an A or a B? No.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you actually helped me when we were working on one for ours, and I was looking out at some of them, and I feel like there were a lot of what you were talking about earlier where they just said, oh, it passes, even though it didn't actually apply. And so I was going back and forth, and I appreciated your thoughts on that as we were writing ours. So I was like, well, I mean, does it pass? We don't have this. Like, there's no images of text. So I guess we passed images.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, I have I'm not going to name them, but there's a very, very large software company out there who says if the criteria is irrelevant and then it passes. And I'm like, no, it's just not relevant. Like, but their logic for saying that is because they haven't failed. And I'm like, that's not the same. It's not the same.
Yeah. I'm not seeing any other questions coming up. Im said, agree that we should move away from scores and just fix what is wrong or build it right at the start. The point should be to create an inclusive and welcoming site for everyone. Yeah. I think so. The last question that I wrote down was when you were talking about user testing, and the way we sort of have approached this is we try to do automated testing, and then we have our developers do manual testing themselves. And then after all those things are fixed, we bring in users. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about like how people can incorporate users in their testing process. Should it be earlier? And also maybe for someone who's new to that, how would they go about finding users?
Yeah. So I would suggest strongly never to do usability testing until you've done automated and manual testing. The reason why is because you don't want to waste your time. You don't want to waste your participants' time. And if there's money involved, like paying stipends, which you should be doing, then you're wasting money. So I would strongly recommend not doing user testing until you've gotten that other stuff out of the way. Because, and I've seen this plenty of times, you're going to have a person failing a task for an extraordinarily obvious reason, right? So I'll give you a great example. I was once testing a jobs website, and this was a jobs site where, you know, you have to, in order to post your resume, you have to have an account, and in order to apply for a job, you have to have a resume, so on and so forth. So if you're testing this whole you know, ability to upload a resume, but the fields don't have labels, or there's like a stupid focus problem or something like that, then you're not really testing the usability of this process. You're getting bogged down in technical problems that should have been addressed in the first place. But once you've done that, the next part would be usability testing. Now, there's a ton of ways to do it right, and there's a ton of ways to do it effectively that aren't like ideal, right? The ideal is, of course, you do a recruit, you have a defined persona, you recruit against that persona, blah, 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 blah. That stuff can get really, really expensive. If you don't have the budget for that, you can grab some people who at least have some domain knowledge in the area of this website, and recruit them to do the testing. Lots of places will, lots of places are out there to finding participants in this. And, you know, NFB, local lighthouses, or any of the other AFB, NFB, and ACB, any of those sort of things, you can reach out to them to see if there are any people who would be willing to participate that should have you covered for non-visual testers. And the same thing goes for, you know, for any other sort of, you know, population. There's plenty of disability rights organizations or advocacy organizations that have lists of, you know, people who might want to participate or might be available to participate, or they'll share your announcement or your call for participants. And like Em said, you know, just make sure you pay them. give them a stipend of some kind. The going rate for stipends is about 75 to 150 bucks. And it's well worth it once you've done that testing, if you're ready for it. By the way, going back to the question about the VPAT, another thing that I thought that I should have mentioned before is there's a new organization that's out there, that is creating trying to create an accessibility reports kind of standard, that's kind of like, well, what they say here in the introduction, a window sticker, similar to a car window sticker for telling people what your performance is for accessibility. So if this is a topic you're interested in and have time for, definitely get in touch with Chris Law and try to participate in that and give your feedback in that, because that is one area of trying to, you know, boil all of this stuff I've been talking about down into something actually digestible for consumers.
Is that a like a self-proclaimed, or like they're going to come and be an external like credentialing body that people can opt into, or do you know much about what they're looking at going to for that window sticker?
I don't know, actually. I guess that sort of has yet to evolve. Step one, of course, was getting people involved in the organization and setting it up, and then I guess there's more to go from that. And I have been only involved in the very, very early days, and with the acquisition of tenant from Level Access, that took up pretty much most of my time throughout the last end of the from fall and summer, or fall to winter and into spring this year. That's kind of been all I've been able to work on.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. This has been fabulous, despite our surprise in the beginning.
And it's in the transcript. I saw it's in the transcript too. So that's a joyous little nugget for later review.
Yes. We will edit that out before we I mean, not just out of the transcript, we'll edit it out of the video too. No, I really did. I swear you all, I jinxed myself because I was talking to Karl before we started letting everyone in about how we've been having this conversation about needing to go to webinars as we grow. And I guess I did. The universe was like, yep, I'm going to throw you a curveball. So I appreciate everyone hanging with us. And I appreciate you, Karl, for giving a great talk and sharing your knowledge with us. We
Thank
will
you.
be back on Monday, June 20th at 7 p.m. where Joe Dolson will be talking about how people can get involved with WordPress accessibility. It's really important talking about testing. We need more people on the accessibility team or who are interested in just helping to test new versions of WordPress as it comes out, or help squashing bugs if you're a developer. So it'll be a great talk. We will be setting it up as a webinar. So stay tuned for that, and there'll be an update on that meetup once we have the actual webinar information.